When I talk about democratic socialism, I'm not looking at Venezuela. I'm not looking at Cuba. I'm looking at countries like Denmark and Sweden. And you know what goes on in those countries? All of the kids.
Well, it seems socialism has become trendy nowadays. Whether it's democratic socialism, communism, or general anti-capitalist sympathies. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, it seems it's become cool again to take other people's money. The thing that worries me about the trend is people don't seem to understand exactly what socialism is, and more dangerously, they don't understand its direct relationship with feudalism. So allow me to explain. We'll talk about feudalism first, and I hope to illustrate my point. Now, feudalism was a system wherein feudal lords owned the land upon which serfs worked, and this was the pretense the lords used to levy taxes on the serfs to extract the wealth they created. That wealth flowed from the serfs to the feudal lords, and the lords in turn kept what they needed and distributed the rest to the aristocrats, which were typically what you might think of as bureaucrats nowadays. They were sort of middle management types who oversaw different workings within the government system. But they and the lords lined their pockets with the wealth of the serfs, taken against the serfs' will, or without the serfs' consent, under the pretense of essentially rent. In return, the aristocrats getting the wealth from the lords legitimized their political power. They would muster armies for the lords. They could lend the lords money if for some reason they didn't have the money to muster a proper military campaign or whatever it might be. But it was through the aristocrats receiving this wealth funneled through the lords that legitimized the lords as the proper political power. It's that relationship that's important. The serfs' wealth is taken by the lords and funneled to the aristocrats, who then in turn support the feudal lords. You have, in a socialist system, you have the government, which seizes the wealth from what Marx called the bourgeois, or the upper class, under the pretense that they, by amassing this private property, have stolen from the proletariat or the working class. So it's that pretense that their wealth is ill-gotten, that the government then takes their wealth and redistributes it. In this case, the wealth comes from the bourgeois, is funneled through the government to the proletariat. Now, much like the aristocrats who receive the wealth in a feudal system, the proletariat are the ones who legitimize the government's political power. They do this a little differently, though. Before, it was through essentially force of arms. In this case, as the world shifted towards democratic rule, the proletariat were able to give the government the votes to legitimize their power. Already we can see some relation between feudalism and socialism, the only difference being the directions in which the wealth flows. But we could simplify this equation as the subject has their wealth drawn by the authority, and that authority then distributes that wealth to the beneficiaries, who are the ones who then legitimize the authority's political power. As such, we begin to see a very clear relationship between feudalism and socialism. It is really one class using the force of government, whether it's the feudal lords and their armies, or modern governments and their democratic mandate, to seize the wealth from those the beneficiaries see as having gained it through ill-gotten manner, those who essentially then become the subject of the authority. So why is this important? Well, for one, simply because you're taking from the rich and giving to the poor instead of taking from the poor and giving to the rich doesn't make the taking any better. It is still the same exercise of government power as it was before. But more importantly, socialism disguises a creeping new feudalism. The beneficiaries in socialism are meant to be the proletariat. But what happens is, since the wealthy have the money and the means to sway and corrupt, you see the proletariat, or the working class, does receive some benefits, but slowly over time the disparity shifts, and you see that where the working class and the poor do gain some benefit from their relationship with the authority, it's the wealthy that begin to get more and more benefit. It skews so that, yes, the poor are getting some wealth redistributed to them, but they're also having their wealth taken, while in this case corporations get even wealthier off of the redistribution. This leads to a very similar system, reminiscent of the feudal system, where the aristocrats are replaced by the corporation, and the serfs are led to believe the lords care for them in some way because they're giving them enough to squeak by. Well, you look at the Department of Education, it's something like 15 cents, comes from the states, goes to DC, and comes back to the states as 13 cents. That's 2 cents for the authority, the government or the feudal lords' pockets, and 13 cents into the public education system, taken from the subjects of the area and redistributed to those schools, those teachers unions that the government sees fit. So immediately you see that where the proletariat believes they're the ones getting the benefits of public education, they're really the ones they're really the serfs having their wealth taken and given to the aristocrats, or the bureaucrats in this case, the teachers unions, the administrators at schools, etc. We see this throughout, that constantly as the government takes more power in the name of helping the little guy, the large guy, the big guy, comes along and corrupts the system for their own ends. So it creates the illusion that the government's on the working class's side, so they will justify the government's political power by voting for them. But at the same time, those corrupting the system will also vote for the same people, so they can continue to reap the greater benefit of that government power. This is particularly troubling because it was a cycle that was supposed to have been broken. There was the American Revolution, the end of monarchies and oligarchies, and the concentration of political power within the individual. Feudalism was the past until Marx came along, and Marx, being a terrible sociologist and an even worse economist, failed in all his theories except for his one endeavor. He was a great marketer. He was able to sell the mechanisms of feudalism as something new, as socialism. But we've seen the mechanisms are no different. And it is plenty easy for those who are powerful to hijack the system. And what it becomes is what we see in Venezuela, what we saw in Cuba, where you see a new feudalism arise. Now the thing is, if only we could have come up with a system somewhere along the way in which the individual simply dealt with another individual, and instead of funneling their wealth through an intermediary who inevitably lined their pockets, they would just trade it between each other. But I don't know what that system might look like, what we might call it. But there it is. That's what looks like the obvious connection between feudalism and socialism, and why I look at any call for socialism, any kind words you have to say for socialists, to me, ill-informed. You're missing the greater picture, and you're asking for the government to be given the power to then turn around and enslave you. And it's not new. It's not something that hasn't happened before. Thousands of years of feudalism have shown what it does to a society. We broke that mold, and now people want to go back.
I don't know. Maybe some people just don't see it. Well, we are the Republic's walls, and they will have to come and take it.